The history of human activity in Indiana, a U.S. state in the Midwest, began with migratory tribes of Native Americans who inhabited Indiana as early as 8000 BC. Tribes succeeded one another in dominance for several thousand years and reached the peak of development during the period of Mississippian culture. The region entered recorded history in the 1670s when the first Europeans came to Indiana and claimed the territory for the Kingdom of France. After France ruled for 100 years, it was defeated by Great Britain in the French and Indian War and ceded its territory east of the Mississippi. Britain held the land for more than 20 years until after its defeat in the American Revolutionary War. At that time, Britain ceded the entire Trans-Allegheny region, including what is now Indiana, to the new United States. The United States government divided the Trans-Allegheny region into several new territories. The largest of these was the Northwest Territory, which was progressively divided into several smaller territories by the United States Congress. In 1800, the Indiana Territory was the first new territory established from a portion of the Northwest Territory. The territory grew in population and development until it was admitted to the Union in 1816 as the 19th state, Indiana. Following statehood, the newly established state government laid out on an ambitious plan to transform Indiana from a segment of the frontier into a developed, well-populated, and thriving state. The state's founders initiated a program that led to the construction of roads, canals, railroads, and state-funded public schools. Despite the noble aims of the project, profligate spending ruined the state's credit. By 1841, the state was near bankruptcy and forced to liquidate most of its public works. By its new Constitution of 1851, it restricted rights of free blacks and excluded them from the suffrage. During the 1850s, the state's population grew to exceed 1 million. The ambitious program of its founders was realized as Indiana became the fourth largest state in terms of population, as measured by the 1860 census. Indiana became politically influential and played an important role in the Union during the American Civil War. Indiana was the first Western state to mobilize for the war, and its soldiers participated in almost every engagement during the war. Following the Civil War, Indiana remained politically important as it became a critical swing state in U.S. presidential elections. It helped decide control of the presidency for 3 decades. During the Indiana gas boom of the late 19th century, industry began to develop rapidly in the state. The state's golden age of literature began in the same time period, increasing its cultural influence. By the early 20th century, Indiana developed into a strong manufacturing state and attracted numerous immigrants and internal migrants to its industries. It experienced setbacks during the Great Depression of the 1930s, construction of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, expansion of the auto industry, urban development, and 2 wars contributed to the state's industrial growth. During the second half of the 20th century, Indiana became a leader in the pharmaceutical industry due to the innovations of companies such as Eli Lilly. Early civilizations. Following the end of the last glacial period, Indiana's topography was dominated by spruce and pine forests and was home to mastodon, caribou, and saber-toothed cats. While northern Indiana had been covered by glaciers, southern Indiana remained unaltered by the icy ease advance, leaving plants and animals that could sustain human communities. Indiana's earliest known inhabitants were Paleo-Indians. Evidence exists that humans were in Indiana as early as the Archaic stage. Hunting camps of the nomadic Clovis culture have been found in Indiana. Carbon dating of artifacts found in the Wyandotte Caves of southern Indiana shows humans mined flint there as early 2000 BC. These nomads ate quantities of freshwater mussels from local streams, as shown by the shell mounds found throughout southern Indiana. The early woodland period in Indiana came between 1000 BC and 200 AD and produced the Adena culture. It domesticated wild squash and made pottery, which were large cultural advances over the Clovis culture. The natives built burial mounds. One of this type has been dated as the oldest earthwork in Anderson's Mounds State Park. Natives in the Middle Woodland period developed the Hopewell culture and may have been in Indiana as early as 200 BC. The Hopewells were the first culture to create permanent settlements in Indiana. About 01 AD, the Hopewells mastered agriculture and grew crops of sunflowers and squash. Around 200 AD, the Hopewells began to construct in mounds used for ceremonies and burials. The Hopewells in Indiana were connected by trade to other native tribes as far away as Central America. For unknown reasons, the Hopewell culture went into decline around 400 and completely disappeared by 500. The late woodland era is generally considered to have begun about 600 AD and lasted until the arrival of Europeans in Indiana. It was a period of rapid cultural change. One of the new developments which has yet to be explained was the introduction of masonry, shown by the construction of large stone forts, many of which overlook the Ohio River. Romantic legend used to attribute the forts to Welsh Indians who supposedly arrived centuries before Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean. Archaeologists and other scholars have found no evidence for that theory and believe that the cultural development was engendered by the Mississippian culture. Mississippian's evidence suggests that after the collapse of the Hopewell, Indiana had a low population until the rise of the Fort Ancient and Mississippian culture around 900 AD. The Ohio River Valley was densely populated by the Mississippians from about 1100 to 1450 AD. The settlements, like those of the Hopewell, were known for the ceremonial earthwork mounds. Some of these remain visible at locations near the Ohio River. The Mississippian mounds were constructed on a harder scale than the mounds built by the Hopewell. The agrarian Mississippian culture was the first to grow maize in the region. The people also developed the bow and arrow and copper working during this time period. Mississippian society was complex, dense, and highly developed. The largest Mississippian city of Cahokia contained as many as 30,000 inhabitants. They had a class society with certain groups specializing as artisans. The elite held related political and religious positions. The cities were typically sited near rivers, representing the cosmology. The central developments were dominated by a large central mound, several smaller mounds, and a large open plaza. Wooden palisades were built later around the complex, apparently for defensive purposes. The remains of a major settlement known as Angel Mounds lie east of present-day Evansville. Mississippian houses were generally square-shaped with plastered walls and thatched roofs. For reasons that remain unclear, the Mississippians disappeared in the middle of the 15th century, about 200 years before the Europeans first entered what would become modern Indiana. Mississippian culture marked the high point of native development in Indiana. It was during this period that American bison began a periodic east-west trek through Indiana, crossing the falls of the Ohio and the Wabash River near modern-day Vincennes. These herds became important to civilizations in southern Indiana and created a well-established buffalo trace, later used by European American pioneers moving west. Before 1600, a major war broke out in eastern North America among Native Americans. It was later called the Beaver Wars. 5 American Indian Iroquois tribes confederated to battle against their neighbors. The Iroquois were opposed by a confederation of primarily Algonquin tribes, including the Shawnee, Miami, Wea, Potawatomi, and the Illinois. These tribes were significantly less advanced than the Mississippian culture that had preceded them. The tribes were semi-nomadic, used stone tools rather than copper, and did not create the large-scale construction and farming works of the Mississippian predecessors. The war continued with sporadic fighting for at least a century as the Iroquois sought to dominate the expanding fur trade with the Europeans. They achieved this goal for several decades. During the war, the Iroquois drove the tribes from the Ohio Valley to the south and west. They kept control of the area for hunting grounds. As a result of the war, several tribes, including the Shawnee, migrated into Indiana, where they attempted to resettle in land belonging to the Miami. The Iroquois gained the military advantage after they were supplied with firearms by the Europeans. With the superior weapons, the Iroquois subjugated at least 30 tribes and nearly destroyed several others in northern Indiana. European contact. When the first Europeans entered Indiana during the 1670s, the region was in the final years of the Beaver Wars. The French attempted to trade with the Algonquin tribes in Indiana, selling them firearms in exchange for furs. This incurred the wrath of the Iroquois, who destroyed a French outpost in Indiana in retaliation. Appalled by the Iroquois, the French continued to supply the western tribes with firearms and openly allied with the Algonquin tribes. A major battle, and a turning point in the conflict, occurred near modern South Bend when the Miami and their allies repulsed a large Iroquois force in an ambush. With the firearms they received from the French, the odds were evened. The war finally ended in 1701 with the Great Peace of Montreal. Both Indian confederacies were left exhausted, having suffered heavy casualties. Much of Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana was left depopulated as many tribes fled west to escape the fighting. The Miami and Potawatomi nations returned to Indiana following the war. Other tribes, such as the Algonquin Lenape, were pushed westward into the Midwest from the East Coast by encroachment of European colonists. Around 1770, the Miami invited the Lenape to settle on the White River. The Shawnee arrived in present-day Indiana after the 3 other nations. These 4 nations were later to be participants in the 60 Years' War, a struggle between native nations and European settlers for control of the Great Lakes region. Hostilities with the tribes began early. The Piankashaw killed 5 French fur traders in 1752 near the Vermilion River. But the tribes also traded successfully with the French for decades. Colonial period. French fur traders from Canada were the first Europeans to enter Indiana, beginning in the 1670s. The quickest route connecting the New France districts of Canada and Louisiana ran along Indiana's Wabash River. The Des Hautes Highlands were once considered the border between the 2 French districts. This made Indiana a vital part of French lines of communication and trade routes. The French established Vincennes as a permanent settlement in Indiana during European rule, but the population of the area remained primarily Native American. As French influence grew in the region, Great Britain, competing with France for control of North America, came to believe that control of Indiana was important to halt French expansion on the continent. France. The first European outpost within modern Indiana was Tassenong, a French trading post established in 1673 near the Kankakee River. French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, came to the area in 1679, claiming it for King Louis XIV of France. La Salle came to explore a portage between the St. Joseph and Kankakee rivers, and Father Ribaud, who traveled with La Salle, marked trees along the way. The marks survived to be photographed in the 19th century. In 1681, La Salle negotiated a common defense treaty between the Illinois and Miami nations against the Iroquois. Further exploration of Indiana led to the French establishing an important trade route between Canada and Louisiana via the Maumee and Wabash rivers. The French built a series of forts and outposts in Indiana as a hedge against the westward expansion of the British colonies from the east coast of North America, and to encourage trade with the native tribes. The tribes were able to procure metal tools, cooking utensils, and other manufactured items in exchange for animal pelts. The French built Fort Miamis in the Miami town of Caquionga. France assigned Jean-Baptiste Bisset, Sieur de Vincennes, as the first agent to the Miami at Caquionga. In 1717, François-Marie Picotet de Balester established the post of lieutenant to discourage the WEA from coming under British influence. In 1732, François-Marie Bisset, Sieur de Vincennes, established a similar post near the Pianca shore in the town that still bears his name, although the forts were garrisoned by men from New France. Fort Vincennes was the only outpost to maintain a permanent European presence until the modern day. Jesuit priests accompanied many of the French soldiers into Indiana in an attempt to convert the natives to Christianity. The Jesuits conducted missionary activities, lived among the natives and learned the languages, and accompanied them on hunts and migrations. Gabriel Marist, one of the first missionaries in Indiana, taught among the Kaskaskia as early as 1712. The missionaries came to have great influence among the natives and played an important role in keeping the native tribes allied with the French. During the French and Indian War, the North American front of the 7 Years' War in Europe, the British directly challenged France for control of the region. Although no pitched battles occurred in Indiana, the native tribes of the region supported the French. At the beginning of the war, the tribes sent large groups of warriors to support the French in resisting the British advance and to raid British colonies. Using Fort Pitt as a forward base, British commander Robert Rogers overcame the native resistance and drove deep into the frontier to capture Fort Detroit. The Rangers moved south from Detroit and captured many of the key French outposts in Indiana, including Fort Miamis and Fort Vincennes. As the war progressed, the French lost control of Canada after the fall of Montreal. No longer able to effectively fight the British in interior North America, they lost Indiana to British forces. By 1761, the French were entirely forced out of Indiana. Following the French expulsion, the native tribes, led by Chief Pontiac, confederated in an attempt to rebel against the British without French assistance. While Pontiac was besieging British-held Fort Detroit, other tribes in Indiana rose up against the British. They were forced to surrender Fort Miamis and Fort Ouiatenon. In 1763, while Pontiac was fighting the British, the French signed the Treaty of Paris and ceded control of Indiana to the British. Great Britain. When the British gained control of Indiana, the entire region was in the middle of Pontiac's rebellion. During the next year, British officials negotiated with the various tribes, splitting them from their alliance with Pontiac. Eventually, Pontiac lost most of his allies, forcing him to make peace with the British on July 25, 1766. As a concession to Pontiac, Great Britain issued a proclamation that the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains was to be reserved for Native Americans. Despite the treaty, Pontiac was still considered a threat to British interests, but after he was murdered on April 20, 1769, the region saw several years of peace. After Britain established peace with the natives, many of the former French trading posts and forts in the region were abandoned. Fort Miami was maintained for several years because it was considered to be of great importance, but even it was eventually abandoned. The Jesuit priests were expelled, and no provisional government was established. The British hoped the French in the area would leave. Many did leave, but the British gradually became more accommodating to the French, who remained and continued the fur trade with the Native American nations. In 1768, a treaty was negotiated between several of the British colonies and the Iroquois. The Iroquois sold the territorial claims to the colonies as part of the treaty. The company created to hold that claim was named the Indiana Land Company, the first recorded use of the word Indiana. The claim was disputed by the colony of Virginia, which did not participate in the treaty because it already laid claim to the land through its royal charter. In 1773, the territory of Indiana was brought under the administration of Province of Quebec to appease its French population. The Quebec Act was listed as one of the intolerable acts the 13 colonies cited as a reason for the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. The 13 colonies thought themselves entitled to the territory for the support of Great Britain during the French and Indian War, and were incensed that it was given to the enemy the colonies had been fighting. Although the United States gained official possession of the region following the conclusion of the American Revolution, British influence on its Native American allies in the region remained strong, especially near Fort Detroit. This influence caused the Northwest Indian War, which began when British-influenced native tribes refused to recognize American authority and were backed in the resistance by British merchants in the area. American military victories in the region and the ratification of the Jay Treaty, which called for British withdrawal from the region's forts, caused a formal evacuation, but the British were not fully expelled from the area until the conclusion of the War of 1812. United States. After the outbreak of the American Revolution, George Rogers Clark was sent from Virginia to enforce its claim to much of the land in the Great Lakes region. In July 1778, Clark and about 175 men crossed the Ohio River and took control of Kaskaskia, Vincennes, and several other villages in British Indiana. The occupation was accomplished without firing a shot because Clark carried letters from the French ambassador stating that France supported the Americans. These letters made most of the French and Native American inhabitants of the area unwilling to support the British. The fort at Vincennes, renamed Fort Sackville by the British, had been abandoned years earlier and no garrison was present when the Americans occupied it. Captain Leonard Helm became the first American commandant at Vincennes. To counter Clark's advance, the British under Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton reoccupied Vincennes with a small force. In February 1779, Clark arrived at Vincennes in a surprise winter expedition and retook the town, capturing Hamilton in the process. This expedition secured most of southern Indiana for the United States. In 1780, emulating Clark's success at Vincennes, French officer Augustin de la Barre organized a militia force of French residents to capture Fort Detroit. While marching to Detroit, the force stopped to sack Kakioma. The delay proved fatal when the expedition met the warriors of the Miami tribe under Miami chief Little turtle along the Eel River, and the entire force was killed or captured. Clark organized another assault on Fort Detroit in 1781, but it was aborted when Chief Joseph Brand captured a significant part of Clark's army at a battle known as Lockery's Defeat, near present-day Aurora, Indiana. Other minor skirmishes occurred in Indiana, including the battle at Petty Fort in 1780. In 1783, when the war came to an end, Britain ceded the entire Trans-Allegheny region to the United States, including Indiana, in the peace treaty negotiated in Paris. Clark's militia was under the authority of the state of Virginia, and although a continental flag was flown over Fort Sackville, the area was governed as Virginia Territory until the state gave it to the United States federal government in 1784. Clark was awarded large tracts of land in southern Indiana for his service in the war, and modern Clark County is named in his honor.